Ambassador Henick, it's wonderful to see you in Tashkent.
Likewise, Navbahor, it's good to see you here as well.
This is our first formal conversation, on-air conversation here. We always talked in Washington.
Right. It'll be 2 years come November.
And when you arrived, there were two major developments, regional, let's say. The United States had just left Afghanistan, and we were dealing with the issues concerning the border, specifically the aircraft issue, and we now are at a point where that issue seems to have settled. Is it all settled? I mean, is that aircraft fully under the control of the Uzbek government now, or is this an ongoing process?
Navbahor, I don't have anything to add to what I've already said on the issue. It's settled.
So the aircraft is at the disposal of Uzbekistan. US will help to maintain it, and that's that.
Again, the details of the program we're not prepared to discuss at this time.
And the objections that we're hearing from the Taliban, does that change anything?
Again, nothing further to.
But the military cooperation is quite active between the two countries, right? The security cooperation.
Military and security cooperation is excellent and getting better every day.
And how much of that has to do with Afghanistan?
I'd say certainly it has a lot to do with the threats that might be emanating from Afghanistan, with potential terrorism threats. Border security is important to our joint efforts to counter narcotics, people smuggling. So, but it's not unique to Afghanistan. I think the United States and Uzbekistan over the last several years have built a very robust security and military partnership to share information, to do exchanges, to enhance our mutual capabilities of meeting these joint threats.
So the Afghanistan factor, I noticed in my conversations with the Uzbek officials, has decreased dramatically. They keep on saying in post-Afghanistan relationship, in post-Afghanistan environment, whereas, for a long time, for at least 2 decades, Afghanistan was such an important factor.
I think that's accurate. Obviously, when we had, American troops, in the region, that, comes with it. There's a whole host of issues in terms of supplying and transportation routes to support those troops. In that sense, I'd say that, over the last couple of years, our relationship here is focused much more narrowly on our bilateral interests, on Uzbekistan, our desire to support Uzbekistan's reform efforts, to support its independence, and certainly also on our shared regional interests as well. So the C5+1 and the Trans-Caspian corridor and issues like that.
And for Uzbekistan, specifically Afghanistan, is already an integral part of Central Asia. So they keep on bringing Afghanistan into the group, even though they're not part of several major regional initiatives. But Tashkent seems to be wanting to include Afghanistan. So just recently, in Termez, Euratom free zone opened. I'm sure you're watching that process. A gigantic economic project right on the Uzbek-Afghan border, and we saw a large delegation of the Taliban come welcome that initiative. It's, we believe, completely run by the Uzbek private sector. Do you see that as a positive development? Is that something that you're watching?
So, Navbahor, I think it's important to remember that the United States is the largest contributor of humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan to this day. We provide, enormous amounts of humanitarian assistance because, like Uzbekistan, we have an interest in making sure that there are no humanitarian crises in Afghanistan, that there's no, security problems that result from, instability as a result of humanitarian crises. And we recognize at the same time that countries in the region, including Uzbekistan, have very legitimate economic interests that they have to deal with in conversation with, the so-called government in Afghanistan. At the same time, we have a very strong dialogue with Uzbekistan about Afghanistan. Uzbekistan is an active participant in the Doha, the international community's Doha process. And so I really think more than anything, our interests are very, very closely aligned, and we continue to work together, and hopefully working together along with our other partners in the international community, the Taliban will realize that it's in their interest to fulfill their commitments to the United States, their commitments to the international community, their commitments on human rights, and that hopefully this Doha process will then be able to move forward.
So you do support the kinds of initiatives that we see now in terms of the creation of a free zone that'll give access to any Afghan for at least 2 weeks, I believe, if they're coming to do business. Afghans can be now employed in that zone in Uzbekistan.
So, Navbahor, you know more of the details than I do. I can't really comment on the zone specifically, but broadly speaking, we do support anything that that helps ordinary Afghan people and contributes to stability, along the border. And we do recognize that Uzbekistan has, very legitimate economic concerns that they need to address. That, I think, should be separate from the question of the Taliban, their desire for international recognition, their desire to have, funds unblocked. Those are issues which we believe need to continue to be dealt collectively by the international community through the Doha process.
These are some of the things actually I heard from even the managers of that zone. They believe that the zone should have nothing to do with the political developments, that no matter what, it should stay open, even if the Afghan government changes in the future or if there are any other instability in Afghanistan. They believe that that zone should continue to function because it's also open for other South Asian countries like Pakistan, and Russians and Chinese are coming there to do business as well. But so far there is nobody from the European Union or the United States. As far as I believe, no businesses have expressed any interest.
Well, like I said, I hope that in the future, again, the Taliban will fulfill their international commitments and we can move towards a process, of normalization, in which case, a lot of countries might be, I think, interested in the economic development of the region.
So it depends on the political will of Kabul.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I remember we discussed your priorities as you were, getting ready to come to Tashkent. Where do you stand right now? If we go back to some of the priorities that you were very passionate about at that time.
I don't remember exactly what I told you last time.
Supporting the political reforms in Uzbekistan, supporting the economic development of Uzbekistan, and connecting the people of America and Uzbekistan.
Those,
just easy tasks.
All of those remain, really, I think, foremost in terms of our priorities here. And I'm really pleased, over the last couple of years with starting with the economic and commercial development of our, relationship. We've seen trade, increasing steadily, more and more interest from U.S. companies in opportunities here in Uzbekistan, more investment, billions of dollars of investment from U.S. companies here in Uzbekistan. And then also in terms of the economic reform process, really the government of Uzbekistan deserves enormous credit for the progress, even just over the last year, in their WTO negotiations, in the reforms that are necessary in order to join the WTO. And so we are really optimistic that Uzbekistan will eventually be a member of the WTO. As you know, U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai was just here a couple of months ago. She doesn't visit every country, and I think her visit here is a reflection of the importance that we attach to our economic relationship and the ongoing reform process. On political reforms, I think we've seen some pretty momentous developments here in Uzbekistan again over the last couple of years. The law against gender-based violence, I think, is a tremendous success and a model for the entire region. Still a lot of work to do. I think the government here and President himself would be the first to recognize that this is passing the law is just the beginning of the process of ensuring gender equality and making sure that women, of course, don't suffer from violence in the home. And we're pleased to partner with the government, but also with civil society and with the media, because civil society and the media were, I think, a very important part of the successful passage of that law, both in terms of consultation, in terms of raising public awareness, and they will be important going forward in terms of the implementation as well. On labor rights, I think we continue to see progress there as well, and we are eager to, and already are working with the government here to try to, following on the historic achievements that they had in terms of eliminating child and forced labor in the cotton harvest, to now make sure that they improve the relationship between employers and their workers, make sure workers know what their rights are and have the ability to work collectively, bargain for better working conditions, And these are things, again, where we're seeing, steady progress, and we're hopeful that things will continue to improve going forward as well.
The government of Uzbekistan now recognizes that the civil society is critical. They're not just talking about the political development of Uzbekistan. They know that they need to have some independent voices that fights and expresses the interests of the private sector and even like the communities. They recognize that the grassroots groups are important, and yet the development is very slow.
Right.
And almost everybody I talk with in the so-called tiny civil society says that it's gotten harder. It's hard to still get registered. It's hard to connect with the Uzbek government. And they also complain, of course, that there isn't much support from the international community, but the official registration is still an issue. How do you see, during your time here, where has the dynamic been going regarding the civil society? Because you do stay engaged with them.
I would say we're seeing progress. It may not always be in a straight line. Sometimes there's, zigs and zags, and sometimes there's steps backwards. Certainly we're familiar with the fact that many civil society organizations have difficulty getting registered here in Uzbekistan. I think what needs to happen, and what we're in the middle of, is a cultural mind shift about the role of NGOs and civil society in the democracy that we have here in Uzbekistan. And there are obviously, I think, some, who grew up in a different system, who see civil society through a different lens. And it's changing the way they view civil society, and making sure that the government officials here see civil society as, okay, occasionally as critics that will hold them to account, but also as potential partners in terms of serving, providing services to the people. So I'm still optimistic, but I would agree, that more progress needs to be made. Another thing I think it's important to look at, and that gives me some cause for optimism, is that civil society doesn't have to look like it looks like in Washington or in Europe and other places. Civil society can be indigenous here. And as you probably know full well, Uzbekistan has a long history, for example, of the mahalla, organization here, these neighborhood councils. And the president himself has, I think, on multiple occasions talked about how important the mahallas are in terms of the development of Uzbekistan. And I think the United States and maybe other international donors need to kind of look at the mahalla, which is not totally independent, it's a quasi-governmental kind of organization, but as an organization which might be able to step into some of those critical civil society functions that are going to be necessary going forward.
And parallel to those mahallas are the bloggers who have formed communities around them. They're the ones who are pushing for local solutions to local issues, and many civil society experts we have talked to, including in the West, they say that we should stop analyzing civil society from that perspective. Like, the civil society isn't just human rights activists.
Right.
Civil society is broader for Uzbekistan, and yet we don't really see much being discussed here. And when we engage the bloggers in those communities, some of them are basically saying, let's not have the discussions, let's not discuss the nature of our work, let's discuss the issues that we're fighting for. So there is that conclusion or belief, strong belief, that our work should show why we matter. Like, maybe just coining us as a civil society isn't something very helpful. And there they say that maybe the West isn't helping either by saying that we have to have independent organizations. Maybe we don't have to be organized.
Yeah, and the same applies for, I think what you're alluding to is, for example, we have a model for how we traditionally see civil society NGOs. We have a model for how we traditionally see media,
right?
As kind of traditional media organizations. And what we're seeing here in Uzbekistan, I think, is some kind of experimentation, but also, growing out of the indigenous experience here, models that don't conform to the, what we traditionally expect to see. And so those can be bloggers or influencers who are working independently and are not, I think, by any stretch of the imagine, traditional media organizations,
yeah, absolutely,
or mahallas and other groups. So I think, I think we need to be open to the fact that Uzbekistan is going to develop democracy in its own way, and if we are truthful in our desire to support that democratic development, we shouldn't be trying to impose a model from the outside. We should be working with the individuals and the organizations that are already here in Uzbekistan.
And what we have also seen, especially what became quite evident in the last 3-4 years, is how corrupt the media environment is. And bloggers and journalists, of course, and press officers, they all form that community. Here in Uzbekistan, you cannot separate them from each other because journalists can be bloggers, they can also be serving as press secretaries, they can be doing somebody's public relations work. And in this environment, we want to discuss the conflicts of interest, we want to discuss the fight against corruption, whereas the community itself seems to be quite mixed. Various players whose work could be creating major conflicts of interest. And it's very interesting because, as you know, our agency just held some trainings on solutions journalism in Uzbekistan, and we had that opportunity to discuss this with journalists and bloggers who tell us that maybe what we are doing is teaching them this polite, very ethical journalism without going deeper into the media environment in Uzbekistan. Maybe they argue that these grants, these media assistance should really support that community as is, because they believe that they can be journalists and bloggers at the same time. They can be activists at the same time. Maybe we shouldn't be teaching them this global, traditional journalistic, at least promoting those values and expecting them to follow. And the government likes the sound of that. They say, yeah, that's good, because let's create our own journalism. Not US influenced journalism or based on Western values, but Uzbek journalism, where we shouldn't really focus on conflicts of interest, but what we're bringing in as a content.
I mean, I do think Uzbekistan should develop journalism in its own way. But I think there are still some universal truths, just like there are some universal basic human rights. And one of those is that, there needs to be a separation, for example, between opinion and factual reporting. This is why, traditional media organizations are trained to clearly label things that are opinion and things that aren't, or things that, for example, are paid pieces of journalism. I think the consumers of that have the right to know when they're reading something, whether it's been paid for by, for example, by the government or by a company, or whether something is just the opinion of an opinion rather than something that meets kind of journalistic standards. So, and there can be conflicts of interest, I think, that are really problematic. So I'd say we need to be careful about saying anything goes. I think there are some basic things, but it doesn't have to look exactly like a Western media organization, as long as we're not kind of crossing any of these red lines that lead to corruption and conflicts of interest.
Mm-hmm. So when you say the United States supports the media freedom, supports the media development of Uzbekistan, what do you mean? What kind of journalists and bloggers do you support?
So we mean a lot of things when we say that. One of them is just morally, that we support independent media and media freedom, and we will advocate, with both publicly and privately with the government, for that. We think that's actually something that, the government of Uzbekistan wants, and the president himself has spoken on a number of occasions
Multiple
about
times.
the critical role of media. In addition, we have programs that support media. Some of those are targeted at individual journalists to give them an opportunity for professional development, give them, for example, opportunities to go to the United States and develop professional contacts there. And then we have more general assistance that can be provided to institutions. Those programs are fairly small right now in Uzbekistan, and really are kind of designed, for what I was saying before, that to try to increase professionalism, teach, some of these basic ethic things. But I'm open to the idea that we need to be a little more flexible with that last category. And, for example, being more inclusive of bloggers and influencers, and to provide them maybe more tools, more expertise to be able to kind of generate their own revenue, to be able to support their activities. But in the end, everybody should be obeying the law. Journalists are not exempt from the law. Neither are government officials. And so I think when it comes to conflicts of interest and corruption, we do need to be careful there.
The constant criticism about the U.S. Embassy, at least in Tashkent, is that you support the liberal voices only. So you don't care about the Muslim bloggers or conservatives or even pro-governments. They say, okay, if I'm pushing for the government's policies, if I'm supporting Mirziyoyev, then the US Embassy doesn't care about me. We've heard that in various conversations. And I know that you're on a regular basis quoted by the Uzbek media, so it's not like the Uzbek society doesn't hear from you, but those who are not part of the programs that you do or engagements that you hold complain about that.
Thank you for sharing the criticism. It's actually not our intent to be focusing only on a particular part of the ideological spectrum. When it comes to example for media freedom, we are very heavily engaged with the more devout parts of Uzbek society, because we believe freedom of religion is not simply about like minority religions here.
Right.
It's about the majority religion as well, the rights of Uzbek Muslims to be able to practice their faith. When it comes to journalists having doing reporting that's pro-government, why would we have a problem with that? I mean, most of our agenda here is to support the government's reform efforts. So if that's the impression, then maybe we need to do a better job of reaching out to those groups and make sure that they feel included as well.
So they also see these critics, some of them at least, and including your critics in the government, see you as an avid supporter of religious freedom and an avid supporter of the LGBTQ plus rights. And that creates resentment. They say that you've been so fixated on these two things that it's become harder for them to talk with you on other issues.
Is there a question there?
Yeah. So how do you react to that?
So we support everybody's human rights. And we don't think that any individual, no matter who they are, have special rights. Everybody has the same basic human rights. Everybody, I believe this both personally and it's my professional kind of job to do this. I believe that everybody has the right to be free from violence. Everybody has the right to have a job, to go to school. We're not suggesting that any particular group should have special rights that aren't enjoyed by everybody else. So I challenge the idea that we're focusing on particular groups. Now, there may be particular groups that have more trouble accessing the same rights as everybody else in Uzbek society, and therefore obviously they're going to get a little bit more attention. So as far as religious freedom, I will say that it is a matter of U.S. government policy to support religious freedom around the world. We were, for example, and that when we do that, I want to be very clear that we're not supporting Christianity, we're not just supporting Judaism, we're supporting all religious freedom. A couple of years ago, we were, I think, among the leading advocates for a Shia group here in Uzbekistan to be able to register a second mosque. And
they got it.
And they were able to do it. And it's a testament to, frankly, Uzbekistan's religious tolerance that these groups that maybe do not reflect the majority of the faithful here are able to practice freely. And Uzbekistan is justifiably proud, it should be proud, of having a history of religious tolerance. But at the same time, we have to we're congressionally mandated to do a religious freedom report every year where we report on the issues of religious freedom in the country. And that can be, registering of churches or mosques. It can be, issues of, being able to, freely pray, being able to, go to mosque or whatever it is. And so, we do our best to be objective about the situation here. We talk to, the religious communities and hear from them their concerns. And at the end of the day, it pains me to think that this might cause tension with the government here, because we're simply trying to help the government live up to its own standards of being a country that is religiously tolerant.
And your position on the LGBTQ plus rights?
Again, I said we support the human rights of all individuals.
And where do you stand in your dialogue with the Uzbek government on that? Because the response, as far as we know from here, is that we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to discuss it. We don't want to talk about it. We don't even want to deal with that issue. We don't have an issue with that, they say, including people like Saida and others, the human rights faces of Uzbekistan. And also, then there are some other voices who say that we have to first protect or ensure the rights of the majority in Uzbekistan. Why are we even talking about these tiny groups of people, whereas the majority of Uzbekistan still has trouble enjoying their rights?
I think it's a fallacy to say, that you have to support the rights of one group over another group. I think, that democratic societies have, I think, an obligation, and Uzbekistan included. Uzbekistan is a signatory to the same international, treaties that the United States is in terms of promising to respect basic human rights, that they will guarantee the rights of all their citizens.
In general, you raise these issues when there are cases, right? They are case-related conversations that you have. It's not like in general you have a program to do this in Uzbekistan.
My public statements speak for themselves. We support the rights of all individuals here.
And we know that the support of the LGBTQ plus community is also President Biden's priority, is one of his priorities. So that priority is also applying to Central Asia, right? So it's not like you're not just raising the issue specifically in Uzbekistan. There is a regional...
There's absolutely nothing we're doing here in Uzbekistan that we're not doing worldwide.
Mm-hmm. So it's the worldwide policy promotion.
Again, Navbahor, we're talking about every individual should have enjoy the same rights. Whether it's again the right to enjoy freedom of religion, the right to free speech, the right to be free from violence. I think we can agree that these are things that everybody should enjoy, right? No matter who they are.
And this approach by the United States will not change even when the presidents change, when the leadership changes in Washington. This is an ongoing effort.
So, having worked for both Republican and Democratic administrations, I see a lot of consistency in terms of our broad policies, mm-hmm. in terms of support for human rights. Emphasis can change depending on the administration, where they want to focus efforts. And so I can't speak to what the next administration might choose to emphasize. But broadly speaking, I think I've worked on Central Asia, as you know, for some time. And I've seen a lot of consistency in terms of our policy here, our support for Uzbekistan's independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, our supports for the regional cooperation and integration. And I think I can confidently say, having worked in the last few administrations, that regardless of who wins our elections coming up in November, that you can expect that our policy towards Uzbekistan will remain consistent.
As we've covered and as we've been observing, Washington's approach towards Central Asia is quite pragmatic. Like, let's get whatever we can get done. Let's work with the governments in ways that they want to work with us. Let's help each other. That's been the approach there. In Tashkent, how do you see it? I know that the first 3-4 years of the Mirziyoyev administration was different than now. Are they more pragmatic now than before?
I think all countries, to a certain degree, are pragmatic, but I think that that's selling our relationship short, to say that it's just simply transactional or pragmatic. I think, we are building a foundation for a long-term relationship. As you know, we elevated our relationship to a strategic partnership dialogue a few years ago, and we did that intentionally because our interests are strategic. They're not, just kind of short-term and transactional.
And we see that from Washington. But from here, though, a lot what the Mirziyoyev administration is doing with you seems to be short-term, though. The efforts to join the World Trade Organization and the assistance that the U.S. is providing seems long-term. At the same time, here we hear that, we want the investment now.
So that's normal. I think it's normal for Uzbeks to be concerned about, their kind of immediate circumstance. And I think that's why President Mirziyoyev and his administration have focused very heavily on economic growth, on job creation, on reduction of poverty. And we are very, pleased to partner with them on those issues and trying to attract the kind of investment here that will create long-term jobs. But I don't think that means that we're being pragmatic or short-term in terms of our relationship. Because as you've said, WTO membership, Trans-Caspian corridor, even the president's emphasis here on education and our partnership programs to help implement those ambitious goals on education, that is a very long-term investment. Our partnerships on security here are about building kind of border security capacity, building changing the way the military does training here, building up an NCO corps among the military. Those are very long-term goals that will change kind of the character and the capabilities of the military going forward. So I would say there's a mix, of course, of kind of short-term needs, but most of what we're doing here, I think, is building a foundation for a strong long-term relationship.
The difference here is that we hear more about that from the United States. There is more analysis that we get from the United States, whereas Tashkent doesn't really provide much. And as a media outlet, covering Uzbekistan from Washington and from the inside, we see the system closing. I spent a few weeks here, and it's been really hard to interview anybody in the Uzbek government. They like to have private conversations, but they don't want to go on the record. Whatever questions you have, they keep on referring to the presidential administration. So the super presidency in Uzbekistan seems to have gotten stronger. How do you see, where do you see the country or the system in terms of political development or evolution at this point? Has it changed during your time here?
I don't know that I have the depth of experience you do to be able to judge kind of like how it's shifting in real time. I will say that I admire the president's strategic ambition, his reform agenda here. I worry though sometimes that the ability of this government to execute that agenda is in jeopardy unless there is more devolution of authority, to the line ministries, to the municipalities, to the hakims. One of the strengths of the United States is, that it's a laboratory of democracy. 50 different states implementing, in some cases, the very same programs that are funded from Washington, but with the freedom to implement them how they want to on the ground. Our education system, we have 50 different, or if not more, education systems because each state sets its own curriculum, determines how it's going to fund education. And the advantage to that is that some municipalities, some states are going to succeed and some are going to fail, and we learn from those successes and failures. I think we need to see more of that type of experimentation here in Uzbekistan as well.
The difference that we see so far in our reporting is that there is more emphasis on the process, which is progress for Uzbekistan, because for the longest time, or always, it's always about the goals, right? You have a roadmap for every issue to solve every major problem, and you want to get there, but not much discussion of the process, like the steps that are necessary to take. In the regions, you see those processes happening. You see people focusing on the process. And yet, the system remains incredibly central where they don't want to provide the explanations there. So the public doesn't really know much about what's really happening, what is shifting and what's not. Isn't that hard for you to deal with Uzbekistan when you have such a closed or untransparent system?
Yeah, I think maybe what you're touching on, Navbahor, is there still a cultural resistance to, we talked about the cultural resistance to NGOs and civil society. The same exists for an independent media. Whether it's government officials here or whether it's officials at the local level, they're still not accustomed. They don't have a lot of experience, dealing with an independent media, dealing with independent bloggers, and knowing kind of how to talk to them, how to be transparent.
Because it's not staged.
Right. And many of them, I think, are worried that, they may say something that would get them into trouble, and nobody's ever going to, praise them for speaking to the media. And so, given the choice of the two things, they prefer not to engage. I think you and I both know that there is something to be gained from being more transparent with the media. It helps to raise public awareness. It helps to build public support. And where there are problems, it draws attention to those problems so that they can be solved before they compound into bigger problems. So I think it's going to take some time for that cultural shift to happen, but I hope we can be part of helping Uzbekistan move in that direction.
We keep on hearing across the country that relative freedom that the country seemed to have starting sometime from 2017 through 2021 was very useful in the sense that people learned to express themselves. There was a wider debate, public debate, at least virtual, and people are more comfortable now discussing issues, at least privately, because of that. And so when we ask journalists and bloggers, they say that Uzbekistan is still way more free than it was under the previous leadership under Islam Karimov, but it's not as free as it was between 2017 and sometime 2021. So your your time here happens to be
After.
Yes,
After that 21
after.
period.
So you're in a post-relative freedom period.
So obviously I can't comment to the situation before I got here, but I will say since I've been here, I've seen some remarkably robust public debates on certain issues. Air quality is one issue, and we were pleased to be part of that discussion by having a air quality monitor here at the embassy. But I think that's an important issue that affects everybody's day-to-day life here. And there was, really, I think, healthy, air quality is not health, but a healthy discussion about the issue, about the role of government, about the role of private sector, how to move forward on that. And I thought that was really useful. We saw the same kind of debate about gender-based violence as well. So I'd like to say that I think we're seeing more and more areas, and they tend to be the areas that touch people's lives personally, where people feel comfortable having that kind of public debate. And I think the more that happens, I think the more that lays a kind of a good foundation going forward to expand those discussions, maybe to areas where previously there's been a little too much sensitivity to have an open discussion.
You engage the presidential administration, you have meetings there, including with President's daughter, Saida Mirziyoyeva, and others. But we almost never see you talking with any of the Uzbekistan's lawmakers. Do you also engage the parliament, which will have elections later this year?
We do. I had meetings with Senator Safayev not long ago. We've had, as you know, over the last year and a half, visits by congressional delegations here to Uzbekistan from Washington, and that's given us also an opportunity to engage with the parliament. We'll be watching the upcoming elections very closely because there'll be a new electoral system for parliamentary representatives. I would say that we are engaging with the parliament. I'd like to see the same kind of transparency from the parliament, and we're seeing some of that. I was encouraged by some of the televised debates that they've had. So we need to see more of that, because I think for Parliament to fulfill its potential here in the Uzbek system, it needs to be empowered. It needs to communicate its role to the public, and we are definitely going to be looking at, and we have some programs, Open World and other programs that will connect the Uzbek Parliament with the U.S. Congress so that we can share our experiences.
Especially the legislative chamber is described to be the closed one. Most of the media community here, they have never been to the Uzbek Parliament. To the Senate, yes. So Senate's, some of the sessions are live, and some of them are at least covered more than the legislative chamber. So the hope within the media community here is that the next parliament maybe will be more open.
We need an Uzbek C-SPAN.
Right, the C-SPAN. But there's also a lot of cynicism here about the upcoming elections, by the way. I mean, especially in the regions, many people don't even know that there are elections approaching, and the parties, especially the 5 parties, that part of Uzbekistan remains unchanged. The attempts to create and register an opposition party has failed so far. And I know that the embassy raised some of that at some point, and I know that your diplomats met with those activists. But do you engage them? Are you still interested in this issue?
So I want to avoid, as the U.S. ambassador, any appearance that I support any one political party. But we do support the registration of opposition parties in Uzbekistan. I think the Uzbek people, Uzbek voters, deserve as much of a choice as they can get. That will actually, in the end, strengthen the democratic system here in Uzbekistan. People will feel like they, are vested in the system if their representatives, the ones that speak to them and get their votes, are represented in parliament. So I think there's still some work to do on that. We'd like to see the political party system here develop a little bit more. As a first step, it would be helpful, even in advance of the upcoming elections, for the 5 parties that are registered to articulate, like, what are their policies? What's the difference between the 5 parties, so that people can, make an informed decision on which party to vote for.
Will the United States observe the elections? Will you have any experts come in? I know that you will observe as part of the OSCE, but have there been any efforts to invite American experts through you to come help or assist?
So, I mean, usually the best way for us to do that is through the OSCE, and we work with the ODIHR mission here. The ODIHR missions will, typically include American experts as well. Our embassy will obviously, be involved. So yeah, we'll be interested to see how the election proceeds.
You know, interestingly, when Uzbekistan had that relative freedom time, just the 3-4 years, the international community, the embassies here, the international organizations, including this embassy, including the United Nations, were more open, more critical of the status quo in Tashkent, and it's now quite silent. I mean, diplomats seem to be quite comfortable with the way the Uzbek government is now, with the leadership, and it's usually whenever we read their statements, whenever they talk at various public events, it's very supportive of everything that's been going on. We know that every partner of Uzbekistan has its own recommendations, has its own wish list, but in general, you've been very complimentary of everything that's happening in Uzbekistan. Is that intentional? Like, how does that come around? Because you seem very comfortable, for example, with the way the presidential administration functions. You have a good relationship with Saida Mirziyoyeva, we believe, and you're fine. You seem to be fine with wherever Uzbekistan is heading next.
I think the administration here deserves a lot of credit for the things that they have done, for the vision that they have articulated, for some of the reforms that have been implemented. But I've been very candid also about where I think things have come up short. And every year, as you know, we produce a very public human rights report in addition to our report on religious freedom, which articulates where we think there are shortcomings. I think it's important, though, that we recognize overall progress and not focus too much on kind of individual areas where there could be improvement, because quite frankly we see this government as a partner that we can work with, and as long as that partnership is productive and we're seeing progress not only in deepening the relationship in areas of mutual interest, but seeing them make progress on their own economic and democratic reforms, then you'll probably continue to hear me say positive things about them.
How comfortable are you with the political nature? You have president's daughter is now president's closest advisor. What does it say about the political development in this country?
I don't presume to judge or cast judgment on the president here in terms of like who he chooses as his advisors. That is up to him.
And with the history of presidential daughters here in this country, in the neighboring Kazakhstan, in the region itself, the experience, because people always judge the situation based on those histories, right?
I think people should be judged on the basis of themselves, not on the basis of somebody else. So, I don't pay much attention to those comparisons.
And you see Saida Mirziyoyeva and others around her as full-fledged officials?
I have dealt with Ms. Mirziyoyeva as an advisor to the president. I think she's been a very productive and capable interlocutor on the issues that we've discussed. But I'm not pretending that she's fulfilling a role that she's not. I think there's been a lot of commentary about like what her role is she being groomed to be a successor to the president?
Right.
Far be it from me to judge that. I don't know what the president's intentions are. Obviously, I think that anybody who succeeds the president needs to be somebody who's elected, and needs to be somebody who's campaigned, and needs to be somebody who is judged in the eyes of the people of Uzbekistan as somebody who has the requisite experience and expertise. I don't presume right now to be able to predict who that might be.
Some of your colleagues who also had conversations with her told me in Washington that they see her as a change maker. So she and others around her claim to be the reformers of Uzbekistan. They are leading the reform process, and they want the reform program, the reform agenda to succeed. How do you see her and the team around President Mirziyoyev now?
I think we're focusing too much on one individual. I've seen, for example, in the 2 years I've been here, there have been, as you know, some shake-ups in the government, new ministers. I've seen a number of younger, Western-educated ministers appointed, who I think have been also really strong advocates for the president's reform agenda. I've also met with a number of ministers who are, I think, kind of appointed because of their technocratic expertise in certain ministries, and I found them also to be, very, very capable interlocutors and, and advocates for the president's agenda as well. So I just worry that like we tend to focus on, like individuals and their relatives, and I think it's probably a mistaken focus.
You know why we tend to focus on that? Because other ministers that you are mentioning were more visible for a while. They're not anymore. So who you see now is President Mirziyoyev and Saida Mirziyoyeva. So there is this natural attention on them, For example, Saida Mirziyoyeva also got recently appointed as someone who's responsible for Karakalpakstan. They're begging for focus. What is new about Uzbekistan? We see that this is something that people actively discuss around the country. They may be whispering, they may not be necessarily, debating on air, but they are paying attention to these things.
Well, I would hope that journalists like yourself, and maybe the ones that you train, in the solutions-based journalism, will resist the kind of, the temptation to just go for like the easy stories.
Sure.
It's be a lot more interesting, I think, and a lot more informative for the Uzbek public if they did focus on some of these other key individuals, I think, who are helping kind of, frankly, transform Uzbekistan and build the Uzbekistan of the future.
This is a very young country, as you know, and you, on a day-to-day basis, I'm sure you meet a lot of Uzbeks. What is new about them? How do you see the Uzbek society changing in your eyes?
Yeah, I think for me it seems like a society that is very much has its eyes open to the rest of the world. And we're seeing, I think, young people for whom it's not difficult at all to imagine, getting, for example, an education abroad or getting, kind of working abroad. And I think that's exciting because I think Uzbekistan, an Uzbekistan that's open to the rest of the world is likely to be one that's going to be able to develop more quickly, to be able to integrate, to be able to diversify its relationships, and ultimately emerge as, I think, a strong and independent partner.
You have worked with Uzbekistan for a while now, for decades. I mean, you started your career here, or you were a young diplomat here when Uzbekistan became independent, and from Washington you also oversaw policy towards Uzbekistan and towards Central Asia. And again, for the longest time, Uzbekistan was a country where we just heard from the government. So we judged everything based on what the government was saying. It was hard to engage the people of Uzbekistan. Now we have more ways to engage, and including the international community, including America. You are in conversation with the Uzbek people, right? We can say that. You're talking with them on a day-to-day basis. So what you hear from the government and what you hear from the people, how connected are those things? How consistent are they with each other?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. I think the president himself is concerned about like hearing from the people, and that's why he's talked about the important role that media has. He's even talked about the important role that bloggers have. And from everything I've seen, the president, either he's reading social media himself or somebody is passing him.
He's definitely following.
Right. And so he knows that I think to be an effective leader of this country, you have to have your finger on the pulse of, the way people feel. I think it's difficult still in Uzbekistan, as much as we've seen things improved. The media environment needs to be, strengthened even further. And people need to, feel comfortable, expressing themselves and seeking out opinions. And I think as we see that develop and improve, we'll see that gap potentially between, the government's voices and the people's voices start to narrow.
And to what extent you take that into account as you analyze your policy here, your own achievements here, and provide, reports to Washington? Like, how is that going to shape U.S. policy towards the region, towards Uzbekistan?
I mean, we are trying to build a relationship that will transcend administrations, whether that's a change in the U.S. administration or a change in the administration here in Uzbekistan. So fundamentally, that is a relationship between our countries, between our peoples. So I'd say, I don't know if we get the balance perfectly right, but, we want to work with the government, because we see the government trying to do things on the, to the benefit of the Uzbek people here. At the same time, we, do want to have a direct conversation with the Uzbek people and to work with them as well.
The word nepotism is quite often raised still in the Uzbek social media, if not in the day-to-day media, even though there are more conversations about the conflicts of interest now in this country. And we did discuss this summer in our trainings about where things stand in terms of like anti-corruption efforts, in the country. So there is some progress there that we observe. And yet, there are concerns that the levels of nepotism in the system is going to affect the economic development of this country, the social development of this country, and in general, the discussions of everything. Do you observe that process as well?
I think that's a problem we face everywhere. It continues to be a problem in the United States and is obviously still a major problem here as well. And corruption is an insidious tax on everybody in the country. And so a number of our programs are intended to strengthen the rule of law here, to work with the anti-corruption agency, to help develop laws on conflict of interest, on financial disclosures of government officials, something that we, including myself, have to do in the United States. These are kind of, I think, best practices from around the world that are that help to frankly try to minimize and reduce corruption. It's never going to completely disappear. But what you want to do is minimize the impact, the negative impact that it can have on a society, on the good functioning of government, on undermining public trust in government. Because people aren't going to trust the government. They're not going to feel comfortable paying taxes to a government if they think that those taxes are going to be misused.
Are you discussing these at the highest levels? Can you talk about this freely, for example, in your meetings with Saida, Mirziyoyeva, and others?
Absolutely. No, we've talked about these and other issues.
And they agree with you, or?
They have echoed the president's desire to tackle corruption and have talked about the need to move various steps forward and implement certain laws. I can't remember like how much in detail we got into in those discussions, but nothing I've heard from the senior officials I've engaged here leads me to believe that that they're not supportive of the president's agenda. Now that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. I think tackling corruption is one of the most difficult things you can do. There are a lot of vested interests, and status quo interests that are going to oppose a lot of the reforms, a lot of the laws that are necessary. So we'll continue to try to work on it.
Yeah, this is why it took so long to actually even get to this point, right? To adopt finally something on conflicts of interest. We believe that you have very candid conversations with the Uzbek government, and one thing that they're still sensitive is the foreign influence. And we've seen what's happening in the neighboring countries, foreign influence, restricting laws and decrees. In Uzbekistan, we don't have that yet. Even though we know that the leadership is still sensitive about who is doing what and who's working, like especially the sources of funding, the intentions of various countries or the governments in Uzbekistan. We know that they're very sensitive about Russian role. They are sensitive also about the Western countries. America's influence, for example. We know that many people who go abroad for trainings or for exchange programs come back and they get interrogated, they get pressured by the security services here. We also know that include visitors to the United States. Are you concerned about that? Do you think that the Uzbek government is concerned about your influence overall, the U.S. assistance influence?
I think the government of Uzbekistan wants to be independent. And we support their goal of being independent. And so obviously any country is going to have to balance its independence with its desire to have relationships with other countries. Uzbekistan continues to be have very close economic relationship with Russia, whether it's through trade, whether it's through remittances from migrant workers. That equals influence to a certain degree. As Uzbekistan's relationship with the United States and with other countries grows stronger, there will be similar, ways for countries to have an influence here. So I think the responsibility is on Uzbekistan and its leadership to make sure that it has a diversity of relationships, so that it ultimately emerges independent as a result. And we support that goal.
In our analysis, we see that Tashkent is more sensitive about the political effect, political influence of Russia, whereas they're more sensitive about American funding. So when it comes to the United States, they care more about the money, like who's doing
what kind of funding? You mean
financially. Oh yeah, like NGOs, activism.
Well, all I can say is, our funding is very transparent. The government is well aware of our various assistance programs and who our partners with are, who we partner with on these programs. So they have ample opportunity to object to these programs if they think it's something that threatens the sovereignty of Uzbekistan. None of our programs are intended to do that.
Have there been any objections since you've been here to anything that's coming from the United States?
Well, we've already talked about how some NGOs have difficulty registering here. But no, I would say that the problem that we encounter most often is just bureaucracy. Coming from a very large government myself, I understand, that, bureaucracy can be challenging, but it is challenging here sometimes, to navigate the bureaucracy.
The USAID expanded its mission a couple of years ago. How is that going? So the programs are expanding and you don't have any issues there?
There's always issues.
In terms, political issues.
Right.
Where are there any projects that the Uzbeks are uncomfortable with?
No, in fact, we have had so much success here that we can't meet the demands of the government. We get constant requests from the government to be involved in this area, to provide technical assistance in this area, to do more in this area, and we simply don't have the resources to be responsive to every one of those requests. And so we work with the government to try to prioritize. We've negotiated, assistance agreements in specific spheres. We have one that covers education. We've talked about it publicly. We're trying to negotiate similar agreements to cover our economic programs, potentially to cover our health programs as well. Quite the contrary, I think, the USAID mission here has been met with open arms by the government here, and our programs are going very, very well. They've had a national level impact. Programs will sometimes work with the government to pilot a program in one or two provinces, but as a testament to kind of how valuable the government sees these programs, they will then take the results of that and using their own funds, scale it to the entire country. So that's for us like what success looks like, is that kind of partnership. And we're seeing more and more of those successes every day.
Ambassador Siddiqov in Washington keeps on telling that Uzbekistan is open to have any kind of a conversation with the United States, that everything is up for discussion. There is nothing that the Mirziyoyev administration is uncomfortable with. And yet, we know of several Americans who haven't been able to visit as experts, as specialists, as university professors, as people who are invited or who Uzbeks would like to have for various purposes here. Do you also deal with those issues? Because, especially keeping in mind the recent law here that essentially prohibits foreigners to say anything critical or anything about the image, history of the Uzbek people and Uzbekistan.
Mm-hmm. So I have not gotten involved in individual cases of people, who are looking to travel here. As far as the law you mentioned, we, have some concerns about the law, but I think we're waiting to see exactly how the government implements the law. I'm not aware of anybody being charged under that law yet.
We don't know of any.
I've been assured by the government that it's not intended to, to restrict the kind of, legitimate criticism that people might have about a government, about its policies. So we'll see. I haven't run into these issues.
But you will raise those issues. Let's say if Americans or Uzbek Americans get focused or targeted.
If Uzbek Americans or any, I think, foreigners are prosecuted here for legitimate free speech, then that will be an issue.
That'll be an issue. One last question. It has to do with Karakalpakstan.
Okay.
You have been one of the very few voices that have been talking about the absence of the final report, like whatever happened in Nukus in July of 2022, whatever happened to the Independent Commission's report. And I was in Karakalpakstan for a few days, and I did talk with the Karakalpak officials and others, and I too asked them what happened.
So you didn't get a copy of the report?
I don't have the copy of the report, but we talked about your calls as well. You know what they said? They said, we don't care about that report. They said, we don't need that report. We know what happened on our soil. That independent commission was supposed to report to the Uzbek parliament. They can do whatever they want to in Tashkent, but here we know it. It's not important for us. But Tashkent here, I mean, the central government hasn't really responded to that. Or have you heard any responses from the Uzbek government to your calls?
I've not. I continue to believe that it would be helpful, both to the government and to the Uzbek people and the international community writ large, for that report to be made public. I think there are still open questions about exactly what happened and whether or not there's been full accountability for the events that happened in Nukus. And obviously the report itself won't necessarily, bring that accountability, but I think it would be an important step to promoting more transparency about what happened and bring us in that direction.
And would you be okay if they say it's a secret, we discussed it internally and we're not going to reveal the findings?
I think that it would, in retrospect, have been very misleading for the government to establish an independent commission, in the wake of those tragic incidents, only for that independent commission to have its report buried.
And that the commission also includes the members of the current parliament whose term is ending. So if they wanted to do anything, they should be doing it now, right? Yeah, the ombudsman of Uzbekistan is the head of that commission. Do you engage them? Are you in touch with them?
Yep.
And they haven't provided you any response to that?
Haven't seen the report yet. I mean, I was told initially that the report was going to be held until the legal proceedings were finished. My understanding is the legal proceedings have finished, and so I don't know why the report has not been published.
The general position of the Uzbek government is that everything is fine in Karakalpakstan. Don't worry. Like, we're good, we've dealt with all the grievances that we heard there. We're funding Karakalpakstan very well now. They have a solid, credible government, and we're fine. Like, don't even touch this topic. That's what we hear. And so you don't hear anything about Karakalpakstan?
I've also visited Karakalpakstan, and I've seen, efforts by the government to address kind of the basic needs of the people in Karakalpakstan. I think there's all kinds of special, tax breaks and, subsidy programs, and I think that's good. I think, it's one of the poorest regions of the country, and I think, it deserves the attention it's getting. The president assigning his daughter, responsibility for Karakalpakstan. Also, we could take that as a political signal as well, that the president really wants, his administration to pay real attention to the needs of the people in Karakalpakstan. That is all very positive, but at the same time, it's not completely reassuring to people who have real questions about what happened in Nukus 2 years ago.
In the short term, is there anything that worries you about Uzbekistan that you would like to change or to see change?
No, I don't have any particular worries. Like I said, I'm very encouraged by the direction that things are going here. I'm very pleased by the developments in our bilateral relationship. I'm very hopeful that there's opportunities going forward for us to continue to strengthen our relationship. So no, I don't.
Any specific dimensions that you're watching, that you're focusing?
Only things we've already discussed. As we know, like the development of civil society. I think I'd like to see a healthier environment so that independent media can thrive here. Those are things that will ultimately support the president's reform agenda. But obviously reduction of bureaucracy. We've talked about the need to devolve more authority to lower levels. I mean, those are, I think, we've covered a lot of the key issues, I think, that are potentially going to be, challenges going forward.
So when we hear the Uzbek ambassador in Washington say we're open for any kind of engagement, for any kind of a conversation with the United States, you agree? There isn't anything that makes
absolutely agree. The government
Uzbekistan comfortable?
The government here has been willing to engage with us on every single issue. Sometimes, they are difficult discussions, but that's something, what you say in Turkish, dostlar acı söyler. Like friends can have those difficult discussions.
The closest we heard Washington describe President Mirziyoyev in terms of pushing for change in Uzbekistan was the adjective they used, reform-minded. A lot of people think that Washington treats Mirziyoyev as a reformer, even though, in my own reporting, I have never heard any American official describe Mirziyoyev as a reformer. The closest was the reform-minded. Alice Wells, your former boss, put that description. How would you describe him politically now? He is President Mirziyoyev, but in terms of his rule.
Yeah, I think whether you call him a reformer or reform-minded, it implies a kind of a level of judgment that I don't want to go into. I think he is a leader with a vision for his country, and he's communicated that vision to his people. The question of whether or not, his administration will be able to execute that vision, remains an open question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Navbahor.
For spending time with us to have this wonderful conversation.
No, I always enjoy talking.